Sarah Parker stared at the stack of papers on her desk. The words "Final Note-A stamped in angry red letters across the top. It had been 6 months since her parents' passing, and her sister Rebecca was already trying to force her out of their childhood home. The irony wasn't lost on her. While Sarah had stayed behind to care for their aging parents, working remotely and sacrificing her social life, Rebecca had married rich and moved to the city. Now she wanted the house, their parents' last gift to both daughters, all to herself. A knock on her office door interrupted her thoughts. "Ms. Parker, the board meeting starts in 5 minutes." "Thank you, Janet," Sarah replied, quickly tucking the papers into her drawer. Nobody at Metropolitan Banking and Trust knew about her personal situation, and she intended to keep it that way. Being the youngest CEO of the bank's history was challenging enough without adding family drama to the mix. Her phone buzzed, another text from Rebecca. "Sign the papers by Friday or we're going to the bank. James says they'll foreclose faster than you can pack." James Anderson, Rebecca's husband and one of the city's top real estate developers, had been pressuring Sarah for months. What they didn't know was that Sarah had deliberately kept her career advancement quiet. As far as they knew, she was still a mid-level financial analyst working from home. The boardroom was already full when Sarah arrived. She'd been CEO for 3 months now, though the announcement wouldn't be public until next week. The board had wanted to keep it quiet until the major merger was complete. Sarah, Charles Winston, the outgoing CEO, greeted her warmly, ready for the official handover next week. Before she could respond, her phone buzzed again. This time it was a series of messages from Rebecca. James spoke to his friend at Metropolitan. "They're fast-tracking the foreclosure. You should have just signed when we asked nicely. Don't worry, we'll let you take your clothes when they kick you out." Sarah felt her jaw clench. She'd spent the last 5 years caring for their parents, using her savings to modify the house for their father's wheelchair, installing a hospital bed for their mother's final months. Rebecca had visited twice, both times complaining about the depressing atmosphere. "Sarah?" Charles's voice brought her back to the present. "Everything all right?" She forced a smile. "Fine, just some family matters to handle." The meeting proceeded smoothly until Janet burst in, looking flustered. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's a situation in the main branch. A James Anderson is demanding to speak with senior management about a foreclosure case. He's causing quite a scene." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She pulled up the security feed on her tablet, and there they were. Rebecca and James, standing in the bank's lobby. Rebecca was wearing her signature designer outfit, James in his expensive suit, both radiating entitlement as they berated the branch manager. "He's saying he has connections here," Janet continued, threatening to call the board directly. Charles raised an eyebrow at Sarah. "Friends of yours?" "My sister and her husband," Sarah said quietly. "They're trying to force me out of our parents' house." She quickly explained the situation to the stunned board members. "Well," Charles smiled, leaning back in his chair, "this should be interesting. How do you want to handle it?" Sarah thought for a moment, then pressed the intercom. "Janet, please tell the branch manager to inform Mr. and Mrs. Anderson that the CEO will see them shortly." The security feed showed the branch manager relaying the message. James's chest puffed up with self-importance. He probably thought his connections had worked. "If you'll excuse me," Sarah stood, straightening her blazer, "I have a meeting with my sister." She took the private elevator down to the main floor, her heels clicking against the marble as she walked through the executive corridor. Through the glass doors, she could see Rebecca and James waiting in the lobby, Rebecca admiring her reflection in the polished walls. Sarah paused for a moment, remembering their last family dinner before their parents passed. Rebecca had spent the entire time talking about her luxury vacation while their mother could barely keep food down from the chemotherapy. Taking a deep breath, Sarah pushed open the doors. "Hello, Rebecca," she said calmly. "I hear you wanted to speak with the CEO about a foreclosure." Rebecca turned, her designer handbag swinging. "Sarah, what are you doing here? We're waiting for the CEO." "Yes," Sarah replied, watching as confusion spread across her sister's perfectly made-up face. "You are." James stepped forward, his expression darkening. "What game are you playing? We're here about your house. The one you're about to lose." Sarah smiled, the kind of smile she perfected in boardroom negotiations. "Actually, I think we should discuss this in my office. Follow me." "Your office?" Rebecca scoffed. Since when do you have an office here? Aren't you working from home? Instead of answering, Sarah turned and walked toward the executive elevator, her keycard opening the doors automatically. She could hear Rebecca and James whispering furiously behind her as they followed. The elevator opened directly into her office suite, where Janet stood waiting with a knowing smile. "Can I get anyone coffee?" she asked. "No need," Sarah replied, walking around her massive desk. Behind it hung her credentials and awards, including her recent 40 under 40 recognition in the banking industry. Rebecca's face had gone pale as she read the nameplate on the desk. Sarah Parker, Chief Executive Officer. "So," Sarah said, settling into her chair, "you wanted to discuss a foreclosure." Rebecca's perfectly glossed lips opened and closed several times before any sound came out. This is impossible," she finally managed. "You were taking care of Mom and Dad. You worked from home." "Yes," Sarah nodded. "I did work from home. As Senior Vice President of Digital Operations, I could manage my team remotely while caring for our parents." She let that sink in before adding, "The promotion to CEO came 3 months ago." James, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly found his voice. "This changes nothing," he declared, though his confident tone wavered slightly. The house," Sarah interrupted, "was left equally to Rebecca and me in our parents' will. I've spent the last 5 years maintaining it, paying the property taxes, and making necessary modifications for Mom and Dad's care." She pulled out a folder from her desk. "Would you like to see the receipts?" Rebecca's face flushed. We didn't know you had a position like this. You never said anything." "You never asked," Sarah replied simply. "In fact, the last time you visited, you spent 20 minutes telling me about your new pool house while Mom was having her chemotherapy session upstairs." The color draining from Rebecca's face. James placed a protective hand on her shoulder, but Sarah noticed his wedding ring was missing. Interesting, considering the gossip she'd heard about his recent late-night meetings with a certain real estate agent. "Now," Sarah continued, "let's talk about your attempt to force a foreclosure through my bank." She pressed a button on her desk phone. "Janet, could you bring in the file on the Anderson property portfolio?" James's head snapped up. "What does my business have to do with this?" "Everything." Sarah accepted the thick folder from Janet. "You see, when you started threatening me with foreclosure, I had our risk assessment team review all your current loans with Metropolitan." Very interesting reading. She opened the folder, watching as James's face grew increasingly pale. "For instance, your new development project on Riverside, the one you're using as collateral for 3 different loans." She raised an eyebrow. "That's called fraud, James." Rebecca turned to her husband. "What is she talking about?" "It's nothing," James said quickly. "Just business." "Fraudulent business," Sarah corrected, "which puts all your loans with Metropolitan under review." She closed the folder with a snap. "Of course, as CEO, I could be persuaded to overlook certain irregularities." Understanding dawned on James's face. "What do you want?" Sarah leaned back in her chair. "First, you'll withdraw any claim to our parents' house. Second," she slid a document across the desk, "you'll sign this agreement giving me full ownership of the property." "And if we refuse?" Rebecca's voice had lost its usual arrogance. "Then Metropolitan Banking and Trust will begin a full audit of James's business dealings." Sarah smiled. "I'm sure the SEC would be very interested in some of these transactions." James grabbed the document and signed it without hesitation, then pushed it toward Rebecca. "Sign it," he hissed. Rebecca's hand trembled as she picked up the pen. "I don't understand," she said as she signed. "Why didn't you tell us about all this, about your success?" "Would it have mattered?" Sarah asked quietly. "Would it have made you visit Mom more during her last months? Would it have stopped you from complaining about Dad's wheelchair ramp ruining your Instagram photos of the house?" Tears welled up in Rebecca's eyes, smudging her expensive mascara. I didn't think." Sarah finished for her. "No, you didn't. You were too busy with your perfect life to notice anything else." She pressed the intercom again. "Janet, please escort Mr. and Mrs. Anderson out." As they stood to leave, Sarah added, "Oh, and Rebecca. Those connections James claimed to have at Metropolitan. They were fired this morning for attempting to illegally access private account information." James practically dragged Rebecca to the elevator, but she turned back at the last moment. "Sarah, I'm sorry. About everything. Sarah watched them leave, then turned to look at the photo on her desk, the last family picture before their father's stroke. They had all been smiling, genuinely happy. Where had it all gone wrong? Her phone buzzed with a message from Charles. Saw the security feed. Beautifully handled. Ready for next week's announcement? Sarah smiled, thinking about how different things would be once her position became public. The board had already approved her proposal to establish a caregiver's assistance program for bank employees, inspired by her own experience with her parents. That evening, as Sarah drove back to her childhood home, she noticed Rebecca's car parked down the street. Her sister sat inside, just watching the house. Sarah parked in the driveway and waited. Finally, Rebecca got out and walked over. Her makeup was gone, her designer clothes wrinkled. "I miss them," she said simply. Sarah looked at their parents' house. Not a property to be fought over, but a home filled with memories. "I know," she replied. "They missed you too." They stood in silence for a moment before Rebecca spoke again. I heard you're starting a program for employees with sick family members." "Yes." Sarah unlocked the front door. "Would you like to come in? Mom's favorite tea set is still here." Rebecca hesitated, then nodded. As they entered the house, Sarah noticed her sister's eyes lingering on the family photos lining the walls, the real wealth their parents had left them. Sometimes, Sarah reflected, the greatest revenge isn't in winning, but in remembering what truly matters. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late for two sisters to find their way back to being family. The next morning, Sarah's phone buzzed with a message from Rebecca. "Found Mom's old recipe book in my closet. Sunday dinner this week." Sarah smiled as she replied, "Bring the book. I'll make Dad's favorite pie." After all, some things were worth more than money or power. A lesson their parents had tried to teach them all along.